Now, my grandfather Andrews, my dad had a brother who was a photographer, and he had a photography shop downtown. And my grandfather used to be the person out front and collect the money and keep the books for his son. I don't know whether grandfather got paid by his son or didn't. But grandfather came to our house, Walter Andrews, my dad's father, every day on his way home from his son's up to his house on Spring Street. And he'd always stop at my dad's, and it was normally, about sometime between 5 and 6 o'clock, just before supper. Occasionally he would have a meal, but not very often. But my dad always brought home a paper and gave it to my grandfather. And so in the 40s, when World War II was starting to really heat up, Grandpa would, he'd lay down on the floor with me, and this was before I went to school and when I was in kindergarten and first grade. And he would go over what had happened that day in the war. So my grandfather really taught me to read before I went to school. And so not only did I know those guys, my grandparents, but I've always said that I wouldn't have been the same person afterwards if I hadn't spent a lot of time with my mother's father out at the lake, and if my Grandpa Andrews hadn't come to our house a lot. And my grandfather Andrews was, he had some college education, and I always said he was the first yuppie I knew, because he had started to buy a whole bunch of land, and then they moved from Montcalm County to Mecosta County, and then the Depression came along, and he didn't really get back into running businesses like he had done before, because he ran a confectionery shop and an ice cream parlor next to the theater for 15 years. And so, and he ran a music shop where he taught violin and piano lessons to people. And afterwards, after the World War II got over, he worked, but he didn't. It was clear that he was only doing it to make enough money to live, and that he wasn't any longer trying to become a wealthy person, which was an interesting thing to have happening, and that you could observe over time, because he used to go to Interlochen, which is up by Traverse City, which is a internationally renowned music center, and he'd go up there and work at Michigan Bakery in the summertime just to make enough money so he could afford to go pursue his violin interests and his music interests. And it was only a subsistence. I mean, I'm sure all he made was minimum wage.